All right, so just to kind of give a reminder of some of the background where we left off last week is, if you remember here in the United States, we were working with William James and his concept of the self concept. And he gave us the idea that we evaluate who we are on an emotional level, and he coined that self-esteem. And how we feel and emote about ourselves has an important implications for the way we feel about ourselves, the way we express ourselves in the world. Hence, personality, the term personality comes from that term persona, which means a mask that you wear to present yourself to the world in a way that you feel is appropriate. And what we know is that there's a lot more behind that mask than what you would, for example, if we were in a live class, present to me who you are right now. And the best example is I'd be willing to bet there's always some exceptions that the way you act at church, the way you act at work, the way you act at the nightclub, and the way you act when you're in the privacy of your home is different for each of those settings. You let a certain aspect of who you are in one setting and inhibit those in another setting in order to present yourself in the light that is expected for the situation. So that's the idea behind the persona. The first one, though, to really develop a theory of personality based on these ideas was actually this fellow named Sigmund Freud. And he came up with, you'll hear that it called the psychodynamic approach. You can also hear it called the psychoanalytic approach. But what Freud basically did is he kind of during his development of his theory is that evolutionary theory was really being developed and promoted. You're getting publications on evolution everywhere. Darwin's books are being published, and a lot of biology and even psychology really took into evolutionary theory and wanted to make sure all their theories were tied to something from an evolutionary biological perspective. Okay. And so what Freud originally, so there's two things about Freud. One is he wanted to very much make a biological theory based on basic human motivations or instincts, as you would say. Okay. But two, he also worked with a clinical population. He was a psychiatrist, neurologist by training, and he recognized that in his practice, that a lot of the individuals that were coming to him with mental illness didn't really know why they were feeling the way they were doing, why they had the outbursts that they had, why they did the things they did that was driving their mental illness. Okay. And so he felt that we have these very basic, evolutionarily based instincts that drive our behaviors on a very unconscious level. And that these unconscious drives then promote or dictate, if you want to say in the purest sense, what our behaviors and our mental processes are going to be. Okay. Um, some things on in this beginning phase of the cultural level of Freud, there are some things that we need to recognize that he did culturally while going through and the developing of his theory. Is him and a colleague of his named Dr. Brewer developed what would come our modern day counseling and psychotherapies. Okay. In that they had a patient, Dr. Brewer actually had the first patient where she came to him and said, I'm telling all my friends about you. that you're effective in what you do and whatnot. And he asked her, well, what is it that I do? And she said, well, I come here every week or every 2 weeks sometimes, and just talking to you relieves my symptoms. And based upon that, him and then Sigmund Freud developed something they called the talking cure. That talking cure was the basis of modern counseling and modern psychotherapy, okay? Meaning that they professionalize the idea of helping someone through talk, okay? And probably on a cultural level too, um, because his theory was an unconscious theory, uh, you have to have special type of training in order to access one's mental life, to really understand them. And this is where you get the notion of the expert in the field of mental health. And if you look at our culture, when someone is having an emotionally difficult time, we often state things like, I'm not qualified to deal with what you're going to. You need to go see an expert. You need to go see a clinician. You need to go see this because I am not an expert. Even if we're just friends trying to help. This idea that in order to recover from a mental illness or a trauma, you have to come to an expert that has unique knowledge started with Sigmund Freud and his colleague Brewer. Okay, so those are some cultural implications that I think are important to state at this time. But what two basic instincts did he feel like every human being had? And he looked at several of them, but he came to two. One is Eros, one is Thanatos, meaning one is what he called the life instinct, and Thanatos is the death instinct, that we're driven to reproduce, to give life, but also the other truth of life is that we all are going to die and that we need to protect ourselves while we're here. So he's going to reduce those two broad concepts of life and death to two very basic biological processes, which are sex and aggression, meaning that we're driven to satisfy sexual needs and we have an aggressive tendency to protect ourselves, but also drive towards the death instinct. Okay. So sex and aggression are going to be his two very basic notions of what drives the majority of our behavior. So again, I think we saw this at the beginning of the semester, so we won't spend too much time on it. But the analogy used for Freud's model is an iceberg model, where with an iceberg, about 10% of the iceberg sets above water and 90% sets below water. Okay. That 10% is our awareness. It's what we're conscious of. It's everything that we can process and think about and understand. Okay. 90% is our unconscious mind. This is an area where we don't really have direct access, but it makes up the majority of our psychological world. Okay. Now, let me see. So, yeah, let's kind of go through these. So, conscious is experience of reality and awareness, mental structures that are non threatening. Okay. The unconscious is broken into three components. The first one, which we've started to talk about with Eros and Thanatos, is the id. The id is the primal part of our unconscious, and it is driven by what is called the pleasure principle, meaning that it's always seeking out gratification and this need for gratification. And there's two that, again, he went from eros to sex to life instinct, so sexual gratification, and thantos are death instinct for aimed towards destructiveness. Okay. Originally, you'll notice this term libido. Whoops. Libido, according to Freud, is what gives us our psychic energy. It's what makes us aware of our existence. It's what gives rise to our ability to be conscious of our world, and it drives a lot of the internal forces. Okay, as we all will see here, and I think a few slides, libido in modern terms means your sex drive. So a person with a high libido is a very sexual person. Someone with a low libido is someone with a less sexually driven. Okay. One thing that we should note about the id is it is the illogical component. If you think about life and death existing together, that's not logical. That's not a logical combination. So this area of our unconscious is primitive, it's chaotic, it's unchangeable, it's amoral, illogical, and unorganized. Okay, so this is the id. It is what our unconscious mind is driven towards. And I just wanted to kind of reflect on this picture of Homer Simpson, because here in a little bit we're going to talk about a component of the unconscious, which is called the superego, which is the moral aspect of the psychic life. Okay, now good and evil have been around for a long time, and this notion that evil is after you and good is after you has existed for eons, and we can see it across cultures. Okay, but the notion that there is these individuals that are individually vying for your soul, this idea of a devil, you have a devil on one shoulder and an angel on one shoulder, and they're vying for your soul from a minute to minute to a day to day basis. This really didn't take hold in Western culture until Sigmund Freud. Okay. You won't find kind of this notion of these individual demons in Western society that are a reflection of the individual and the reflection of the person's potential for goodness and badness until after we see Sigmund Freud really take hold in our culture. Okay. But going on to the other aspects of the unconscious, we do have the ego. Okay. And I'm going to skip to this third bullet point. It is the decision making and executive branch of the psychological system. Okay. It does have access to our conscious reality world and the needs and the desires of our id. Okay. It operates on what Freud called the reality principle. All right. If the id had its choice, it would be beating up whoever it wanted, having sex with whoever it wanted, and just being wild and gratify seeking. And if you could imagine, if that was the case, our species would have not lasted that long. We would have went extinct a long time ago. So the mental system needed to have something that regulated the and mediated the needs of reality versus the needs of the id and the pleasure principle. Okay. So this is kind of that decision making branch about how do we satisfy those primitive needs while also being able to successfully navigate and survive in the world. Okay. And then this is that super ego that operates on what's called the idealistic principle. Okay. It has no energy, it has no contact of the outside. And I just want to make sure that we understand this. The superego is not looking for us to be happy. It's not a happiness drive. It is driven towards perfection. Okay. And it's to focus on is in the conscious world, it's what you should not do. And in the ego ideal, it's what we should do. So we have this slide, I think, here. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we'll get to that. So this is the morality. And again, morality doesn't always equal happiness. And I just want to bring that out. Okay. So, but it is meant as the counterbalance to this sensation seeking, gratifying needs of the id right here. Okay. So the basic model for Freud is we have the external world, our sensations and social demands. We have the needs of the id, the needs of the superego, and then the ego then decides on what behavior or emotional response we'll have. Okay. So if we were to look at it kind of from a very simplistic perspective, okay, a person who has an oversized id and a smaller ego and superego is someone who is a high risk taker, pleasure seeker, someone that always needs instant gratification, and is that really impulsive person that looks for sensation after sensation. Okay. If we look at it from a superego perspective, if you have a large superego, and a smaller ego or an id. This is someone who is guilt ridden. They always feel guilty for what they did. I used to joke in classes, and I guess I'm going to do a joke right now. This is basically a Catholic, okay? Often feeling very guilt ridden about their behaviors and ideas and needing to go repent. That's a joke, um, but it is that person who is often feeling like they're not doing anything right. Okay. A healthy individual would be someone who has a larger ego and a same size id and the same size superego because those things need to balance off with each other. Yes, it's important to act moral in a society, but you can't deny the pleasures of the world either. So seeking out a balance between those by having a larger executive processing system tends to balance those two things out. Okay. So this is kind of a simplistic overview of Freud's system. Okay. And so just some other things that kind of came out of his ideas is he mentioned the expression of the libido. And so narcissism grows out of an excessive libido because it's an excessive self-love for someone. And he differentiated narcissism with love, which love for him was the libido invested in another object or person. Okay. He also noted and came up with ideas of difference between sadism and masochism. Okay, sadism is when someone cannot get sexual pleasure without some type of pain being inflicted on them. Okay, no, sadism is inflicting pain. Excuse me, and masochism is the inability to um, have pleasure without suffering some type of pain and humiliation. And in Freudian terms, this is because the id, which again is sex and aggression, is larger than what the ego and the superego could handle, as you would say. Okay. Um, okay. So I'm not going to go over these too much. Other than I would say that these have had a large implications for things like grief models um, uh, and cognitive and behavioral models of treatment, those types of things. But Freud, and actually this would be Anna Freud, his daughter, came up with mechanisms we use to defend our ego, okay, to make it sure that we don't get injured in our mind, okay. And she called these defense mechanisms. And for the sake of this class, I'm just going to kind of just rehearse them really quickly. For a full description, I know we go over them in SSE 211 group processes. And I think we do a pretty good job in Intro to Psych going over these. But these are just ways that we protect ourselves from psychological harm, but over time, they themselves become harmful. Okay. So, just really quick. So, denial is not acknowledging there's a problem. So, it's getting a diagnosis of some disease state and saying, no, I don't have that.
That's what I was gonna ask. Did it stop recording?
I might have logged them out.
Hey, class. Sorry about that. I just lost internet. Everyone's still here? Sorry that our internet went out and I had to reboot our thingy.
Yeah, I'm here.
All right, you're good. All right. All right. Well, let's let's try and get through Freud at least, and then we'll go from there. Hopefully, this doesn't happen again. Let's give this a try. Thanks for sticking in there, everyone. All right. All right. That was weird. Okay, let's try this again. So I'm not sure where we disconnected, but we were talking about defense mechanisms. And just as a quick review, denial is not acknowledging that something bad or something horrible has happened to the individual. And it's kind of a temporary psychological mechanism that we often use. Indeed, one of the first processes of grief is denial and denying that you lost a loved one or you have a horrific diagnosis of some type or something like that. So it's a very common one, but it only can work in a for a short period of time. Um, Repression is the idea of suppressing a memory until it disappears into the subconscious to where you can't remember it. The example here is a woman doesn't recall being raped. The issue with repression is that from at least the data that we have, you can't purposely forget something. Okay. And so suppression has kind of been redefined over the years as we collect more and more evidence. And this idea of suppression, if we want to put it this way, um, comes from a very simple analogy. These studies get a lot more complex than this, but it's the pink elephant example. Okay, if I were to have you imagine a pink elephant, whether it's a stuffed one, a live one, Dumbo, whoever you want, but get that pink elephant in your head. And then the moment you forget about it, let me know. Okay, and we did this, if we did this in the class, and a lot of times, a minute or two, a lot of students will raise their hand and say, I forgot. And I ask, what did you forget? The pink elephant. Well, now you remember it again. Because when you forget to forget, you forget what you're forgetting. Okay. But, but, so the idea that we can purposely forget something has pretty much been debunked. But our brain does have mechanisms to limit access to certain memories. Okay. So, for example, in this example, recalling being raped and stuff, I remember when I worked with victims of abuse, I would often, we do a crisis intervention at the hospital or something and help them out. And then I'd always mark on my calendar to get a hold of them about 9 months later. Now, that doesn't mean we'd stop services. We still, get them into counseling, all those kinds of things, but I make sure that no matter what happens, I reconnected with them in 9 months. Because what usually happens is around 9 months is when the flashbacks start to happen, where the trauma responses to certain smells or certain colors start to happen, nightmares and night terrors start to happen. Because usually around the ninth month is when the person feels safe. They're getting psychologically and social distance between them and their offender. Their life is usually starting to stabilize. And that's when the brain, specifically within the amygdala and the hypothalamus area, say, okay, it's safe for this person to remember. So it start releasing glimpses of that event. Okay. This is why in some verified cases, and I want to say that cautiously, that some adults who recall childhood trauma memories um, didn't remember them into adulthood because they didn't feel safe until they got out of that home. And once they were out of that home and they were on their own and they were doing okay, again, the amygdala and the hippocampus said, okay, it's safe for them to start remembering those memories. I say that with caution. In the other classes, we talk about some of the caveats behind childhood repressed memories and whatnot. But in really validated cases, we do find these instances where it seems like the brain did block a portion of that child's life because it didn't, if you think of your brain having consciousness, it didn't think that it was safe for your survival to remember those things in those contexts. Okay. So that's repression. Projection is putting your own beliefs or behaviors onto someone else, talking about how stupid a video game is with someone when you really like the video game, but everyone thinks it's stupid. If we look at, for example, individuals who uh, um, are pedophilic, they often put those disgusting ideas that they have onto other people. Okay. So if you think about, for example, I'll just bring up the stereotypical example of the priest. Okay. Well, the priest represents someone who is holy, kind, giving. Therefore, his behaviors he projects onto other people who don't belong to his congregation or his church or his religion. It's not him that has those thoughts and those feelings, it's someone else. And it's a way of getting rid of those anxieties that one has about their own thoughts and their own feelings by putting them on someone else. Okay. Regression is acting in a way that is not typical for your age. Again, the example I use in my other classes is that uh, our just like our body has a fight or flight reaction, our brain goes through a fight or flight reaction. Okay. In our body, the body sends all the energy and the blood flow from the center of the body to its extremities because we're either going to run with our legs or we're going to fight with our arms. And it starts to shut down the digestive system and those kinds of things. Hence, if you look at some war scenes and someone is urinating themselves, it's because they're having a fight or flight response, and the body is getting rid of things that it's excessively investing energy and work on to put it into its arms and legs. Okay. Well, the brain does the same thing. When we get heavily stressed, our brain will start to stop using the higher cortical areas, and it will send all the blood, if you want to put it this way, all the nutrients and energy to the survival areas of the brain. So we're talking about the limbic system, the brain stem, all of those things that deal with autonomic processes and survival. Okay. Um, and the best behavioral example of this, there's two that I'll just bring up really quick. I should note, so when the brain does that, it's going to rely on that amygdala hippocampus relationship to determine which behaviors to use. Okay. And our brain is going to use the memories that we know best, that it knows best, that has been deeply ingrained in our system. And the behaviors that are best well kept in our brain system are behaviors that were learned between the age of 3 and 6. Okay. And so when you're going through a stress response, I'll take you through two. Let's say an argument with your partner. The beginning of the argument starts out very logically, higher cortical areas of the brain, decision-making areas of the brain are going off, theory of mind stuff is happening, and you have a very beginning phases of a logical conversation, as we usually put it in the beginning. But then as each partner starts to emotionally react, the more, if you notice an argument between a couple or between friends, it starts very adult-like and usually ends up very childlike, where you're calling each other names, you're kind of, you could be slapping and scratching at each other and yelling, and so you're acting, if you want to put it this way, very childish, okay? And that's because your brain had a stress response that then put the fight and flight response in. You no longer have access to your higher cortical areas, and your best well-learned behaviors are going to come out. The other example is in the courtroom, and defense attorneys know regression very well. So they often will get a victim of abuse, and this is why getting trained to be on a stand, if you're a victim and you have to get up and be on a stand, is important. Spend that time with the victims advocates and the attorneys, and be prepared to be on the stand, because defense attorneys know this. So they will pressure the victim. They will pressure them and get them stressed and stressed and stressed to a point they don't know what to do, but admit those behaviors that the amygdala and the hippocampus have the best access to. Okay. And I don't know about you guys. I know I did this when I was a kid. If I was injured and I didn't know how to respond, I might laugh. I might giggle. I might make it an inappropriate joke. I will get in a shell and act very fearful, or I will just close up and not be able to answer anymore. Okay. And the defense attorney looks for those regressive behaviors. And so let's say the victim giggles, the defense attorney goes, see, she thinks it's a joke. Your Honor, we should get her off the stand and wipe away her testimony. She's laughing at this situation. Get him off the stand. Okay. I say that for two reasons. One, in my other classes, I want to make sure that you as a counselor or a therapist knows these things so that you can help prepare your clients for these kind of situations, because not only do defense attorneys know it, offenders know it as well. Okay. But that's a long explanation for regression, but it's an important one. Displacement is showing emotions towards someone or something completely unrelated to the cause of the emotion. So an alcoholic gets in a car accident while driving drunk and blames his wife. Okay. This is very common in the correction systems. When you first interview an offender in the prison system, you go, "Why are you here?" And they'll often say, "Because that dumb cop was there, because I had a stupid attorney, because of that a-hole judge." And they'll say all of the other things in their world that is caused them to be where they are, but they can't say, "Well, I drank a bunch of alcohol and I decided to go for a drive." You will very seldom hear that in those very beginning days of the correction system. And again, if the correction system has good programming, the goal is to get them from blaming everyone else, displacing what they did on someone else. And so it's not the a-hole cop or the jerk judge. It was me who committed that behavior. I did that. Okay. Now, in the systems, it gets a little bit more complicated than that. There's some, definitely, what do we call it? Legal advocacy or social justice things that need to be a caveat to that, but that's beyond the scope of this class, but it's a simple example. Okay. And then rationalization is making up an explanation for why something happened. So, for example, a rapist thinking that the girl wanted it because she was dressed seductively and she must have been raped, needed to be raped, or it was okay to rape her. Okay. Interestingly, it's kind of an interesting thing to note is that not only do the offenders do this, but so do onlookers, people who hear these stories will often say, oh, it must be the way she dressed. It must be because she does this. It's because she drinks. She does this. And what are they doing in the situation? Okay. I don't think it's necessarily that they're wanting to blame the victim. It's that they want to psychologically distance themselves from the victim. Because if I recognize that I could dress like that, I could drink, I can do that, and that would lead to me being raped, then all I got to do is not do those things and I'm safe. I'm different from that person. Okay. Which is not true. I will tell you, this idea that only drunk, seductive dressing women get raped is the biggest myth that you could ever come up with in this world. But again, that's another soapbox issue. Take another one of my classes where we go through these a little bit more depth. But these are some common things that Freud and especially his daughter came up with. Now, I want to skip to this so that we kind of finish up with Freud's theory. And that's so when he developed his theory, and this is a very common misconception, everyone felt that Freud developed his developmental theory before he developed his unconscious drive theory. And that's not actually true. Okay. Uh, he developed this developmental theory well after he developed his theory about sex and aggression. Okay. I say that because there's some interesting things about this theory that if you take out those sexual contexts, does actually start to make sense in these developmental phases. But let me explain this. First of all, Freud became to believe that all dysfunction that is driven by our unconscious mind occurred because of the development of the child in the early childhood years. That the relationship between the mother and the child, and even in some cases the father and the child, and the dysfunction that occurs really is what drives most of our psychological world. Hence, the stereotype of a therapist, they're going to want they're going to want to know about the relationship between your mom and you, and we want to go down to your earliest memory of what happened in your life and dig stuff up. That stereotypes comes from this Freudian theory. Okay. I will tell you there's not much evidence that shows doing that is actually therapeutic. But there are some camps of psychologists who still maintain it's necessary, even though the scientific evidence suggests there's no real evidence that it's helpful in the recovery of some mental illness or mental health issue. Just wanted to put that out there, but there's still that stereotype. What Freud believed is that because he had a sexual model, that each stage of development had to deal with a certain area of the body that needed to have some gratification, okay, or receive some type of pleasure. And again, if you spell pleasure in Freudian terms, it's sex, okay. And what is one of the first areas that a person needs to receive pleasure from? Well, it's the sucking reflex. All right. If you ever want to know the difficulties an infant goes through just to get some type of sustenance in their body, try to drink a 6-ounce bottle with the nipple of milk or your favorite juice. It takes a lot of work. Indeed, a lot of the reason why breast milk has so much fat content in it is because if it did, the calories out versus the calories in would be unbalanced, meaning that the infant would be expending too many calories for the calories that they're actually ingesting. Okay, so suckling takes a lot of work. So there must be a reason that the infant, according to Freud, would engage in such laborious behavior. Okay. And so he came up with the first stage of development he called the oral stage, where pleasure is centered around the sucking reflex in the mouth. Okay. And if someone didn't overcome their need for oral gratification, they became what he called orally fixated. He himself felt that he was orally fixated because he had to have a cigar in his mouth pretty much constantly from, I believe, like the age of 12 or so. And he actually died of jaw cancer because of his cigar smoking. Okay. But let's talk about this in a Western cultural perspective, right? Some of the things that he also used to explain oral fixation is things like obesity and addiction, okay? He believed people who were overweight is because they needed that constant oral gratification from ingesting food, okay? And so here's a cultural aspect of this that is still well ingrained in the medical field. What is the first thing a medical or a health profession tells you to do in order to lose weight? Stop eating so much, right? Lower your calorie intake and all those things, which is uh, okay, but that's not the reason why people are actually heavy or light or skinny. Okay. It denies the notion of things like genetics and metabolism rates. And indeed, what we found is that people who tend to be obese or grossly obese don't eat much more than people who are underweight. So this idea that people become fat, I'm going to use that term because they eat too much, you're being a Sigmund Freud. That's a Freudian notion that he kind of came up with because people need to have oral gratification, right? My best example of this is I have a very skinny brother. He's like a twig. And when we were kids, we'd go to McDonald's and he'd have like 5 Big Macs, and I could only handle one, but he wouldn't gain an ounce. Okay. This is that idea. Right. And same things with addictions and all of those things, being a need to gratify oneself orally is also something that should be noted as a cultural theme, not a something that still exists. The next phase, though, is what happens between 18 months to 3 years. Now, I'm going to put this in simple terms from a cultural perspective. If there's a thing that we should celebrate, I know that they do these kindergarten graduations. I think there's even preschool graduations and stuff like that. Birthdays, we celebrate, marriages, college graduation. We have all of these things. I really feel like the first time we should give a graduation ceremony or throw a party for a child is when they become potty trained. Okay. Because I want you to think about, we don't think about it as adults, but I want you to think about the significance of potty training. Okay. Because there's one social thing that's going on, and then there's one personal biological thing that is going on. Okay. The first thing that's going on is when we're potty training, it's going to be really the first time we give into the demands of an authority figure. Someone's that's saying, don't poop in your diaper anymore. No, you got to use the potty here. And we're going to start following their direction in order to get the correct behavior. That's the first thing. The second thing is once we learn how to potty train ourselves, it will be the first time that we take biological control over a biological system. It's the first time where we're going to say that I'm going to potty at this location during this time, not right now. Okay, so we're taking internal control of a biological process, And we're also giving into an authority figure of some type and following direction. What a significant thing, in my opinion. We should have potty training parties. Okay. But what was going on with Freud and his ideas? If you have it, think about any time you have ever called someone anal. And what does that mean? Because this is where the term that person is anal comes from. Okay. For Freud, someone who is anally fixated is someone who, because they couldn't take internal control of their biological processes, they couldn't control their internal world, they take excessive control of their external world. Okay. So this is the person who you open their closet and their shoes are in perfect order and the perfect colors and their clothes are hanged just perfectly. This is the person who comes into the office and their office has to be perfectly established and things need to go a certain way and people need to fall in line with what they're directing them to do. That's someone who is anally fixated. And if you think about the term we use for people like that today, whenever you're calling someone anal, it's not that it necessarily you're calling them something to deal with their butt. It's actually you're using a Freudian term to describe their behavior. Okay. So think about that in that context. Again, this is a cultural aspect of Freud's theory that still live with us today, the same as with the oral idea of weight control, okay, or the ingestion idea of weight control. These are two things that still are part of our cultural world, okay. The next phase, and probably the most controversial phase for Freud, was the next phase between 3 to 6 years old, which is the phallic stage of development. Okay, this is where I'm going to put this in this term. During this period of time, Freud and noticed with all of his children and stuff that he could walk into them on the bathroom and they could be rubbing their private parts. They and this is very common for children between the age of 3 and 6. In fact, in modern science, you can find uh, um, um, uh, infants in the womb prenatally touching their genitals. Okay. And so this is a very common behavior. And really quick, I just want to put this again on the soapbox end of this. Okay. If you walk in on a child and they're touching themselves, please don't freak out, but use it as an opportunity to see if there's anything bad going on in the child's life by simply asking them why are they engaging in that behavior. Put it in their terms that dependent on the age they are. If they say it feels good, then that's a normal process that a child goes through. If they say, well, it feels good when Uncle Bob does it, or they start to bring in other individuals who taught them that behavior, then it's time to get concerned and start to look at the nefarious parts of that and the bad parts of that. But for Freud, this is something that was very common during this age group. And so he decided that this is the genital stage of development or phallic phase of development. Okay, but where are the sexual feelings towards? And this is again where his theory kind of uh, people have a hard time with it. Those sexual feelings are towards the parent. Okay, and so there's two of them, I believe. No, no, no. Um, uh, uh, the first one is what was known, and this is something that Freud termed as the Oedipus complex. Okay, if anyone knows the story of Oedipus, it's a Greek tale about a boy who kills his dad to have sex with his mother. Um, and so this is in this complex, it's a boy's intense desire to replace the father and enjoy the affections of the mother. The issue is how does the child do this? Well, the child realizes that the father knows how to get mom's affection. So what does the child do? They model their behaviors after the father. Okay, so that's why they're invested, little boys are invested in being like dad. Okay. Now I'm going to say Oedipus was probably the furthest person away from the complex that is named after him. Indeed, when the prophecy, his parents learned about the prophecy, they actually sent him away to another town where he was raised by parents who he thought were his biological parents. But then at an older age, he heard of that prophecy. So to avoid doing that with the parents he thought was his true parents, he moved back to the city where his biological parents were. And then that's where the prophecy was fulfilled, because he didn't even know that person that he was engaging with was his actual mother. So I bring this example up because I think even the Greeks understood that there's not really this driven desire for this. Now, Carl Jung is going to add what he called the Electra complex, where this is where the girl wants to replace the mother for the father's affection. Okay. Now, if we were to look at this, though, from an important perspective during this age period, and we take out the notions of sex and replacing someone from there to replace a parent in order to get the affection of another, and we take kind of, I'm just going to say it, the weirdness out of this. There is something going on during this age of development that we need to know, talk about, and that's when kids engage in role play. So this is where most of your personality and your self-concept are going to be developed. In fact, the best predictor of whether a child will go to college or not is their attitudes and emotions about school at the age of 5. Okay, that identity they have with it. All right. Well, what's one area that we start to role play? Well, we start to role play relationships between the opposite sex, or in some cases, the same sex. Okay. And we start to learn what it's like to interact with the opposite sex. Okay. And some evidence to support this notion that it's important is we have enough generations where children were raised by single parents. Now, don't get me wrong, single parents are awesome, but there are some single parents who, because of their bad experiences in relationships, a mother with a young boy, that mother may guard that young boy from having any type of males in their life. So they don't have any male role models. And same thing with some single dads who have had horrible experiences with women. They might guard their daughter from having any type of relationship or role modeling relationship with another female. Okay. And what we have found with these children who were raised in those guarded places where they didn't have the opportunity to see dad interacting with a female or mom interacting with a male. We didn't have grandparents or the like to do those role modeling for us. We find that those children grow up to have very difficult times in intimate relationships. They don't know how to react to their intimate partners. Okay. And if I were to guess, because Freud really didn't want to make his developmental theory originally sexual, but he had to because of his theory. If I were to guess what Freud was trying to get at, it would be that relationship development and that role modeling that 3 to 6 year olds go through. Okay. And just to get through these really quick, latency stage, Freud believed that pretty much nothing happened between the age of about 6 and puberty. That really we do some skill development, maybe some talent development. We learn how to write and do math and those kinds of things, but nothing really significantly developmentally happens until we get into puberty. And I'm going to leave this at this because this is the last cultural implication. There's two cultural implications, is when Freud did this and he said nothing really happens, people don't pay attention a lot to children during this age group. In fact, if you look up the literature on child development, this is the most neglected age group that we have. Okay. And the next implication is when we get into adulthood, Freud also said that at the age of 18, your development stops. By 18, you have all of your intelligence, you have all of your maturations, you have all of your personality, and nothing's going to happen after that period of time. Hence, a lot of places say that you can be an adult at 18, you should be able to be on your own at 18, and all of those kinds of things. Those come from, again, Freudian notions that have now that then antedated the Western culture as we know it. Okay. All right. I'm going to stop there.